Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. When my daughter told me that I should find somewhere else to die because I was useless now, I reacted the way I always had. I packed my bags quietly, like the obedient mother I had spent my entire life being. 3 days later, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, realizing that the man I had believed was a loving husband had actually been playing the longest chess match in history. Lauren was about to learn that sometimes a pawn does not stay a pawn but turns into the queen. If you are watching this, please subscribe and tell me where you are watching from. Let me explain how I went from being a homeless widow to the woman holding every card in her hands, because this story twists more than a factory that makes pretzels. Just 2 months earlier, I was Evelyn Carter, a devoted wife of 43 years and the mother of one spectacularly ungrateful daughter. When Thomas died from a heart attack at the age of 71, I believed my entire world was collapsing. Lauren appeared in the middle of my grief like a vulture wrapped in designer clothing, talking endlessly about how hard this must be for me. She explained at length that I could not possibly manage such a big house by myself, listing the stairs, the repairs, and all the painful memories as if she were doing me a favor. Only later did I understand the calculation behind those words. Lauren had always been Thomas's favorite, the perfect little princess who could never do anything wrong. After she married Daniel, the investment banker, and began giving him grandchildren, Thomas showered all of them with attention. I, on the other hand, was simply the woman who cooked, cleaned, and kept the household running. After the funeral, her pressure grew stronger. She would bring Daniel over for family dinners, cornering me with real estate brochures and pamphlets for retirement communities. She talked about how wonderful those places were, explaining that I would be surrounded by people my own age with activities and no responsibilities. What they truly meant was that there would be no inheritance to divide and no inconvenient mother in the way. The final blow came last Tuesday. I had been living in what Lauren had started calling our house for 6 weeks since Thomas's death, still sleeping in the guest room because I could not face packing up our bedroom. That day she arrived without warning, Daniel at her side and 2 large suitcases in tow. She announced that they had made a decision, explaining that Daniel had received a promotion, and that they needed to move into town immediately because the house was perfect for them. I stared at her in confusion, trying to remind her that it was my home. For a brief moment, her polite mask slipped and revealed the cold calculation underneath. She then explained that, according to her father's will, she had inherited everything. She listed the house, the investments, all of it, and added that she had only allowed me to stay out of kindness but that it was time for me to find another place. Her words struck me like a physical blow. I insisted there must have been a mistake, but she calmly said there was none, adding that her father knew she would take better care of his legacy than I ever could. She reminded me that I had never understood money or investments and reduced my entire life to 3 words, saying that I was just the wife. 43 years collapsed into that sentence. Then she delivered the final cruelty, telling me again to find somewhere else to die because I was useless now. I packed my belongings in a single day, fitting 43 years of marriage into 2 suitcases and a small box of photographs. Lauren stood in the doorway watching me, checking her watch as if I were delaying something important. She suggested a senior complex on Maple Street with the cheerful tone of someone recommending a restaurant, describing it as very affordable, and saying she was sure they had openings. Affordable. My daughter was inheriting $33 million and was directing me toward what was essentially a welfare residence for elderly people. Daniel placed my suitcases into their BMW with the efficiency of someone throwing out trash. He told me that I would enjoy having my independence again, and that I would no longer have to worry about house maintenance or property taxes, never quite meeting my eyes. As the car pulled away, I watched my home disappear in the mirror, the house that had once been mine, then Thomas's and now Lauren's. The irony was impossible to miss. I had spent 4 decades turning that building into a home, hosting birthday parties for Lauren, nursing Thomas through illness, and maintaining every detail he cared about. Now I was being driven to a budget motel like an unwanted guest who had overstayed her welcome. The Sunset Inn was exactly what anyone would expect from a place charging $49 a night, with thin walls, even thinner towels and carpet that had seen better decades. Lauren handed me $200 in cash as if tipping a hotel maid and explained that it should cover me for a few days while I got settled, promising that Daniel would transfer some money once they sorted through her father's paperwork. After they left, I sat on the sagging mattress trying to understand what had just happened. In the span of 3 hours, I had gone from grieving widow to homeless senior citizen. The daughter I had raised, loved, and sacrificed everything for had thrown me away like an expired prescription. But as I sat in that depressing motel room, a troubling thought kept returning to me. Thomas had always been meticulous about his affairs, obsessively organized with every important document. Years earlier he had shown me his will, carefully explaining his wishes and making sure I understood, and I was completely certain that it had not said what Lauren claimed. Thomas could be traditional, stubborn, and even patronizing about money, but he was never cruel. The man who had held my hand through my mother's death and surprised me with flowers every anniversary would not have left me destitute, so the next morning I used the motel's wireless internet to look up Thomas's attorney, Richard Palmer, the same lawyer who had managed our home purchase and many of our business matters over the years. His office was downtown, a 20-minute bus ride that drained what little cash I had left, yet it felt unavoidable. Richard Palmer was a distinguished man in his 70s, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. When his secretary announced that Mrs. Carter was there regarding her husband's estate, he appeared genuinely surprised and said that he had been wondering when I would finally come in. He explained that he had tried calling my house several times, but that Lauren told him I was traveling. Traveling, that was the story my daughter had given him. I told Mr. Palmer that I needed to ask about Thomas's will, and he looked puzzled. He asked whether Lauren had not given me my copy, since he had provided her with the original and several additional copies after the reading. My stomach sank. There had been a reading. He reminded me that I was supposed to be there, but that Lauren claimed I was too distraught and that she would handle everything and make sure I received my inheritance. The blood drained from my face as the truth struck me. I told him that I had never been informed about any reading, and that Lauren had told me she inherited everything. Richard Palmer's face shifted from confusion to alarm. He grabbed a thick file folder, his movements suddenly urgent, and said that what I was describing was impossible because my husband's will was very specific about my inheritance. He pulled out the document, and I immediately recognized Thomas's neat signature at the bottom, properly witnessed and notarized. As Richard began to read, I understood that Lauren had lied about absolutely everything. The will stated that Thomas Edward Carter, being of sound mind and body, left to his beloved wife Evelyn Marie Carter our primary residence at 847 Oakwood Drive, including all furnishings and personal effects, and also 70% of all financial assets, investments, and accounts totaling approximately $23 million. My head started spinning at the number $23 million, along with the house and 70% of everything. Richard continued, his voice turning more serious, explaining that to his daughter Lauren Carter Mitchell, Thomas left $10 million to be held in trust with distributions beginning on her 45th birthday, contingent upon her treatment of her mother after his death. Contingent upon her treatment of me. Thomas had known, somehow predicting exactly what Lauren would attempt. I told Mr. Palmer that Lauren had said I inherited nothing, that she had moved into my house, handed me $200, and suggested I find a senior facility. The elderly lawyer's face flushed with anger, as he explained that what Lauren had done amounted to elder abuse and fraud. He added that she had committed multiple felonies, and that the documents she showed me were likely forged or pulled from an earlier draft, because Thomas had updated his will 6 months before his death out of concern for Lauren's entitlement and her attitude toward money. The room felt as if it were spinning. I remembered all the times Lauren dismissed my opinions, talked over me at family dinners, and rolled her eyes whenever I tried to join conversations about their expensive trips or Daniel's business dealings. Thomas had been watching all along, judging and deciding. Then Richard said there was more. The trust clause for Lauren stated that if she failed to treat me with respect and dignity after Thomas's death, the entire $10 million would revert to me. I stared at him in disbelief and asked whether that meant my daughter had just cost herself $10 million. He confirmed that her inheritance was now mine as well. He explained that I was not inheriting $23 million but $33 million, plus the house and all personal property. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. Lauren had been so eager to grab her inheritance that she had triggered the very clause meant to protect me from her greed. I asked what I should do now, my voice barely steady. Richard smiled, and for the first time since Thomas's death I felt genuine warmth directed at me. He said that the next step was to call the police about the fraud, and then inform Lauren that she was about to receive the shock of her life. When I asked whether she could fight this, he answered that she would have no money to do so, because every account she believed she controlled actually belonged to me. Every investment, every bank account, and every asset except the house was already frozen while her fraudulent activity was investigated. I pictured Lauren in my home, planning renovations and buying furniture with money she thought was hers, while Daniel calculated how the inheritance would affect his portfolio. They had no idea that in about 6 hours their entire world would implode. Richard Palmer's office turned into what he cheerfully called Operation Justice. He contacted the police, the banks, and a private investigator while I sat in his leather chair, still absorbing the scale of Lauren's betrayal. Detective Alvarez reviewed the forged documents and explained that they were quite sophisticated, saying this was not a spur-of-the-moment crime but something carefully planned. When I asked whether she thought Lauren had help, the detective replied that creating convincing legal forgeries required special knowledge and connections. She said they would need to investigate whether Daniel, or someone in his financial network, was involved. Within 2 hours, every account was frozen. Lauren's credit cards linked to what she believed were her inheritance funds were declined, and the house utilities she had transferred into her name were suspended until ownership could be verified. At exactly 3:47 in the afternoon my phone rang, and Lauren's name appeared. She demanded to know where I was, complaining about a mix-up with the bank and saying that Daddy's assets were frozen. I told her calmly that I was sitting in Richard Palmer's office, reminding her that he was the attorney who had read the real will while she claimed I was traveling. There was silence. Then she accused me of misunderstanding, but I replied that I had discovered she was a liar and a thief, and that her father had been far smarter than either of us had realized. She tried to justify herself by saying she was protecting me from the complexity of managing all that money, but her explanation no longer mattered. You told me that I had never had to deal with investments, but I answered that I understood everything perfectly. I said that you forged legal documents, committed fraud, and threw your 67-year-old mother out of her own home because you assumed I was too foolish to notice. Her voice grew sharp and desperate as she insisted that I was confused, that grief had overwhelmed me, and that someone must be taking advantage of my emotional state. The audacity of it all was breathtaking. Even when caught in the act, Lauren tried to manipulate me. I told her clearly that not only had she never inherited anything, but that her real inheritance, the $10 million her father left her, now belonged to me as well because of the clause about treating me with dignity and respect. She said that was impossible. I explained that Detective Alvarez was sitting right beside me, and that she could discuss the impossibility of fraud charges at any time. The line went silent, and I could almost hear Lauren's thoughts racing, calculating, hunting for another angle. She begged to meet and talk things through reasonably, hoping we could work something out. I replied that we would indeed be meeting, but at the courthouse when she was arraigned. When she insisted I would never press charges against my own daughter, something cold and final settled in my chest, and I told her to watch me before ending the call. Richard looked at me with approval and explained that Detective Alvarez already had enough evidence for a warrant and that Lauren would be arrested that evening, with Daniel's financial records being subpoenaed as well. My phone buzzed with a message from Lauren begging me not to do this and asking me to think about the grandchildren. Detective Alvarez smiled grimly at the text and described it as classic emotional manipulation. I replied that I was thinking about them and that they deserved to see what happens when someone steals from family. 20 minutes later Daniel called, trying to persuade me to resolve everything quietly, and saying that involving the police was excessive. I asked him directly whether he had helped forge the documents. He dodged the question, talking about pressure and my supposed mental state, which was answer enough. I told him that both of them would be arrested, that they would face federal fraud charges, and that I would be sitting in my house watching it all unfold. When he pleaded for reason, I reminded him that I had been reasonable for 43 years, and that it had not served me well. Lauren was arrested at 8:30 in the evening while dining at Leonard, reportedly celebrating her inheritance. She screamed about false arrest and demanded her lawyer, who turned out to be Daniel's golf friend with no criminal experience. Daniel was taken into custody at his office the following morning. The forensic accountant traced the forged documents back to a printing company his firm used for fake investment prospectuses, revealing a criminal history I had never known about. That night I slept in my house for the first time in 43 years, in the master bedroom. Lauren had filled it with her clutter of designer clothes and expensive cosmetics, erasing Thomas's careful order. I stuffed everything into garbage bags and left them on the porch for her to retrieve when she made bail. The house felt different, not because Thomas was gone, but because I finally recognized it as mine. For decades I had maintained it as Thomas's sanctuary, shaped around his needs and vision. Now I saw how little of myself had ever lived in those rooms, and I knew that was about to change. Richard called at noon with updates, telling me that Lauren's bail was set at $50,000 and Daniel's at $200,000, the judge unimpressed with his financial record. I told Richard that I wanted to make changes to the house. Lauren had arranged contractors for renovations, and I intended to move forward, but with my own plans. He encouraged me, reminding me that it was my home now. What pleased me most was undoing every assumption Lauren had made. She planned to gut the kitchen, replace the hardwood floors, and turn Thomas's study into a wine cellar. I was going to make the study an art studio and replace the wine cellar with a library. Then my phone rang from an unknown number. Rebecca Stone from Channel 7 News said they understood I was the victim of a major elder fraud case involving my daughter, and asked whether I would share my story. In a city this size, the arrest of a prominent investment banker and his wife for defrauding his elderly mother-in-law was already news. I told her I was not ready to speak publicly, but she gently suggested that my experience could help other seniors recognize family financial abuse, and I had to admit that she was right. How many other women my age were being manipulated by their adult children, who viewed them as inconvenient obstacles standing between them and an inheritance? If I chose to tell my story, would I be able to control how it was presented? Miss Stone assured me that I would, explaining that we could arrange a sit-down interview where I would approve the final edit. I pictured Lauren sitting in a jail cell, still convinced she could charm her way out of everything. I told Miss Stone that I would get back to her because I might have quite a story to share. After hanging up, I poured myself a glass of the expensive wine Daniel had sent us for Christmas, wine that I was now drinking in my own house that I had purchased with my own money, while wondering whether I was really prepared to humiliate my daughter on television. Life had taken a strange turn. Then the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock in the morning, sharp and insistent. Through the window I saw Lauren standing on my porch in yesterday's clothes, looking as though she had aged 5 years overnight. Somehow she had made bail. I opened the door but did not invite her inside. She begged to talk, and I reminded her that we had already talked when she told me to find somewhere to die, and that I had instead found somewhere to live. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her usual perfect composure was shattered. She admitted to making terrible mistakes but insisted that she was still my daughter. I replied that daughters do not usually forge legal documents to steal their mother's inheritance. She tried to claim she had not been stealing, then faltered when she could not find words that did not sound criminal. When I asked what she thought she was doing, she repeated that she had been trying to protect me from making poor financial decisions because I had never managed large sums of money. Even after being arrested for fraud, she still could not face the truth. In her mind, she remained the victim. I told her that 6 months before he died, her father confided that he was worried about her sense of entitlement, her attitude toward money, and the way she treated people she saw as beneath her. She denied it, but I explained that Thomas had compared her to his sister Vivian, describing her as beautiful, charming, and incapable of thinking about anyone but herself. He had changed the will because he feared what she would do to me if she had control. When she accused me of lying, I took out my phone and showed her a recording. I explained that her father had made a video to be played if she ever contested the will or treated me badly after his death. She stared at the screen like it was dangerous. I told her he had known exactly who she was beneath the charm, and that the only thing he had not predicted was how far she would go. When she whispered for me to play it, I touched the screen and Thomas's calm, devastating voice filled the air. He said that if she was hearing the message, it meant his fears about her character had been justified and that if I was playing it, she had proven him right in the worst way. Lauren collapsed onto the porch steps as the recording continued. He spoke about watching me sacrifice my dreams, ambitions, and independence for 43 years, about the part-time jobs I took to help pay for her college, and the opportunities one gave up to be the wife and mother I believed we needed. The message went on for 3 more minutes, every word slicing through her excuses. He ended by saying that by the time she heard it, she would have learned that treating her mother badly had cost her everything and that he hoped it had been worth it. When the recording stopped, Lauren was crying real broken sobs, whispering that he hated her. I told her he had loved her enough to hope she would prove him wrong, and that she had chosen otherwise. When she asked what would happen now, I told her she would face the fraud charges, the investigation, and the public humiliation when the story reached the news. I mentioned that Channel 7 wanted to interview me about elder financial abuse and that I was considering it. Her face crumpled as she begged me to think about the grandchildren, Daniel's career, and the family. I replied that I was thinking about how she had not considered any of that when she committed multiple felonies. She rose slowly, defeated, and admitted that she had wanted the money, the security, the status, and to never worry again. For the first time, she was honest. I told her that wanting something does not excuse destroying people to get it. She asked how to fix it, and I said she could begin by admitting that what she did was wrong, not complicated or protective, but unforgivably wrong, and then face whatever came next with dignity instead of manipulation. She studied me then, perhaps seeing for the first time not the mother she could push aside, but the woman who had outmaneuvered her completely. I asked whether I really deserved all of this and then answered myself that yes, Lauren, you absolutely did. 3 days after her tearful confession on my porch, Daniel's mother appeared at my door. Vivian Mitchell was exactly as I imagined, perfectly coiffed, covered in jewelry, and glowing with the entitlement that only comes from 3 generations of inherited wealth. She announced that we needed to discuss the situation rationally. I let her in, curious to hear the story the Mitchell family had invented to explain their son's felony charges. Vivian settled into my living room as if she were granting me an audience and remarked that Daniel had made some poor choices, but that prosecuting him seemed rather vindictive. I reminded her that her son had helped steal my inheritance and thrown me out of my own house. She insisted that Daniel had simply followed Lauren's lead and did not understand the full situation, effectively trying to blame my daughter for her son's crimes. I told her plainly that forging legal documents was not following someone, it was conspiracy to commit fraud. She replied that Daniel's lawyer believed we could reach a settlement that benefited everyone, where I would get my house back, Lauren would face what she called appropriate consequences, and Daniel would avoid the publicity of a trial. I asked what kind of settlement she meant, and she smiled as though she had found an opening, saying that Daniel's family was prepared to compensate me for my inconvenience with $2 million in exchange for dropping the charges against him. I told her that her son had helped steal $33 million from me, and that $2 million did not begin to cover that. She urged me to be realistic, pointing out that Daniel had a career, children, and a reputation, and that sending him to prison served no one. I answered that it served justice. Her polished exterior cracked as she accused me of destroying families over money. I would never have known how to manage anyway, echoing the same condescension that had poisoned my relationship with Lauren. I ended the meeting, but she raised the offer to $5 million as a final proposal. I refused again. Vivian stood, her composure restored, and warned that Daniel's legal team had uncovered information about Thomas's business practices that could become public at trial. The threat was obvious, but instead of fear I felt curiosity and asked what kind of information she meant. She implied that it might make me reconsider who the real criminal was. After she left, I called Richard immediately. He said that whatever they believed they had found did not change the facts of Lauren and Daniel's crimes, though it could influence a jury if they managed to cast doubt on Thomas's character. I thought about my 43 years of marriage and all the secrets that might be buried there and told Richard that I wanted to know everything about Thomas's business, every deal and every irregularity. That evening I sat in what was now my study and went through Thomas's files one by one. He had kept everything meticulously dated and categorized, yet deeper in the records I noticed strange payments to shell companies, excessive consulting fees, and partnerships with firms that seemed not to exist. By midnight I uncovered something that shattered everything I believed about my husband. The private investigator Richard hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena Park, spent 6 hours photographing documents and assembling what she called the real picture of Thomas's business empire. She told me that my husband had been running a sophisticated money laundering operation through his consulting firm, involving millions of dollars over the past decade. I said that was impossible, that Thomas was the most honest man I knew, but she replied that the evidence was overwhelming and that he had been laundering money for organized crime families using his legitimate business as cover. I stared at the invoices for services never rendered, the contracts with non-existent companies, and the payment schedules that lined up with known criminal activity. When I asked how long it had been going on, she said at least 12 years, probably longer. 12 years. While I had been planning dinner parties and attending charity galas, my husband had been enabling criminal enterprises. Lena then added that the $10 million Thomas left Lauren came directly from laundered funds, and that if the federal authorities discovered this, they would seize everything as criminal proceeds. The room began to spin as I asked whether that meant everything, the house and the investments too. She hesitated before explaining that unless Lauren and Daniel's legal team already knew about this and planned to use it as leverage, they could tip off the authorities and negotiate immunity for themselves in exchange for cooperation. My daughter and her husband were not just thieves. They were holding something like a nuclear weapon over my head. I asked Lena what my options were. She explained that legally I could contact the federal authorities myself, come forward voluntarily, and hope for leniency. I would lose most of the money, but I might be allowed to keep the house. If I did nothing, Lauren and Daniel's lawyers would likely leak the information strategically. Either way, I would lose everything, and I could even face charges for unknowingly benefiting from criminal activity. I thought about Vivian Mitchell and her smug certainty that I would accept their settlement. They had known about Thomas's crimes all along. I asked Lena how they could have found out, and she said Daniel, being an investment banker, would have recognized the patterns in Thomas's financial records. The real question was what they planned to do with that knowledge. My phone rang and Lauren's name appeared. She said we needed to meet that night because there were things about her father that changed everything. I told her I already knew. After a pause, she admitted that Daniel's lawyers had contacted the federal investigators and were offering a renegotiation. In her version of the deal, Daniel would get immunity by giving up information about Thomas's criminal network. I would keep $5 million in the house, the rest would go to the government, and all fraud charges against her would vanish. It was brilliant in a sociopathic way. She had turned my moral victory into her advantage. I told her she was asking me to profit from my own crimes by exploiting her father's crimes. She said she was asking me to be practical and warned that the alternative was losing everything and facing charges myself. I looked around Thomas's study, finally seeing it clearly: the furniture, the books, the artwork, all paid for with dirty money. I told her I needed time to think. She reminded me that the meeting with the federal investigators was the next morning, and that Daniel's lawyer needed an answer that night. After the call ended, I sat in the darkness of the study surrounded by proof of my husband's double life. 43 years of marriage to a stranger and a daughter who had inherited not just money, but his talent for deception. She had made one mistake, though, by underestimating me when I was cornered. I called Lena and asked how quickly she could arrange a meeting with the federal authorities because I had a story they would want to hear. Agent Emily Brooks arrived looking exactly like a federal investigator should, serious, intelligent, and completely immune to charm. She recorded everything as I described: Thomas's hidden business, Lauren's fraud scheme, Daniel's forged documents, and the extortion attempt disguised as a settlement. She said that my daughter believed she could trade information about my husband's crimes for immunity, and I confirmed that she thought I would cooperate out of fear. When Agent Brooks asked whether I was afraid, I told her that 2 weeks earlier I had been a grieving widow in a budget motel, and now I was voluntarily confessing to federal agents about my dead husband's criminal enterprise. Fear was no longer my strongest emotion. Anger was. Pure, focused anger at decades of being underestimated. She smiled and asked whether I would be willing to wear a wire. 3 hours later, I was sitting in my living room with a recording device taped to my chest, waiting for Lauren and Daniel to arrive for what they believed was my surrender. They knocked at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, dressed as though attending a business dinner, Daniel carrying a briefcase filled with agreements. Lauren greeted me with forced warmth, saying I looked better. I replied that clarity had that effect. Daniel opened his case efficiently and explained that their lawyers had created a favorable deal for me, in which I would keep the house, $5 million in clean assets, and complete immunity from charges tied to Thomas's activities. When I repeated the phrase clean assets, Lauren shot him a warning look and insisted that the important thing was that we all move on. I asked what would happen to the $33 million Thomas had left me. She said it was tainted and that taking $5 million was the best possible outcome. Then I asked what they were getting from this arrangement. Daniel leaned forward confidently and said that Lauren's charges would disappear. His reputation would remain intact, and the family could heal. He still called felony fraud a misunderstanding. I asked him when exactly he had discovered Thomas's criminal activities, whether he knew before marrying Lauren or only when planning to steal my inheritance. Daniel and Lauren exchanged glances. Evelyn, he said that he did not think that was relevant to our current discussion. I answered that it was absolutely relevant, because if he had known about Thomas's crimes and stayed silent, that made him an accessory after the fact. And if he only discovered them while committing his own crimes, that made him remarkably unlucky. Lauren's composure began to crack as she asked what I was getting at. I explained that the two of them had been planning this for months, maybe even years. The forged will, the convenient discovery of money laundering, even Daniel's connections to document forgers, none of it was spontaneous. He called that ridiculous, and I replied that Agent Brooks found it quite plausible. The color drained from both their faces when I mentioned her name. Daniel whispered about the FBI, and I said that she had been very interested in my story of systematic elder abuse, fraud, and extortion, especially the part where they tried to blackmail me with my dead husband's crimes. Daniel stood abruptly and reached for his briefcase, announcing that the conversation was over. I told him that I thought it was only just beginning. Agent Brooks entered my living room with two other federal agents while Lauren and Daniel sat frozen. The briefcase Daniel had reached for was taken immediately, along with both of their phones. The agent stated that Lauren Carter Mitchell and Daniel Mitchell were under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, elder abuse, and attempted extortion of a federal witness. Lauren turned to me with pure betrayal on her face and asked how I could do this to my own family. I replied that I was doing it the same way she had forged documents and stolen my inheritance, except that my way was legal. As they were being handcuffed, Daniel made one last attempt, warning that people connected to Thomas's business would not appreciate federal attention and that I had put myself in danger. Agent Brooks paused and asked whether he was threatening a federal witness, and when he said he was only warning me, she told him that he had just added witness intimidation to his charges. After they were removed, Agent Brooks sat back down across from me and said that Daniel's warning might not have been empty, because my husband had been connected to dangerous people, mainly the Torino crime family, who had laundered money through legitimate businesses for decades, including Thomas's consulting firm. The name meant nothing to me, but her expression told me enough. I asked whether that meant I was in real physical danger. She said potentially, but added that there was something else I needed to know that changed everything. She pulled out a thick file folder that suggested months of investigation, and explained that my husband had not just been laundering money for the Torino family. He had been an informant for the FBI. For 12 years he had provided information while appearing to facilitate their laundering, working deep cover in a long-term investigation so sensitive that even local offices were unaware. The FBI had allowed him to keep a percentage of the laundered funds as payment and to preserve his cover. Everything he left me had been earned through legitimate federal cooperation. I stared at her trying to absorb it as she confirmed that the $33 million was legally mine. She said that although Thomas died before the investigation ended, his cooperation over 12 years had led to 47 arrests and the seizure of more than $200 million in criminal assets. I asked why no one had told me, and she explained that the investigation was ongoing and that they had not been sure of my involvement. She added that my daughter and son-in-law's fraud had actually helped prove my innocence. They had suspected criminal activity but had no idea about the federal cooperation, and their attempt to blackmail me would have exposed the truth instead. I remarked on the irony of Lauren trying to steal my inheritance twice, first through fraud and then through blackmail. When I asked what would happen next, Agent Brooks said I would get my money back, that my daughter and son-in-law would face federal charges, and that I could decide what kind of life I wanted with my legitimate inheritance, adding that the Torino family would be too busy dealing with their own legal problems, with warrants being executed across 3 states the next morning. I looked around my living room, now seeing it as the place of my rebirth instead of my humiliation, and asked whether it made me a terrible person to feel satisfied about Lauren's arrest. She smiled and said that in her professional opinion I was a woman who refused to be victimized, which was inspiring. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my renovated house making coffee for two. The morning sun streamed through new windows that finally opened properly, lighting the countertops I had chosen myself for the first time in 43 years. Dr. Emily Park, Lena's sister and my new financial advisor, appeared in the doorway with a thick folder of investment reports, and I greeted her, ready for our quarterly review as I reflected on the whirlwind of the past 6 months. Lauren and Daniel were each serving 18-month federal sentences. The media attention around their crimes had turned me into something of a minor celebrity in senior advocacy circles. Emily sat down at my new breakfast table and told me that my portfolio was performing beautifully, that the charitable foundation was fully operational, and that the scholarship fund had already chosen its first recipients. The Evelyn Carter Foundation for Elder Protection had become the center of my life. With $15 million from my inheritance, we were paying for legal aid for seniors facing financial abuse by family and backing legislative efforts to strengthen elder protection laws. I asked whether there was any news about the documentary, and Emily said Netflix had confirmed the production deal and wanted to start filming the following month. My story had traveled far beyond the original headlines. A limited series titled The Mother's Revenge, an American crime story, was in development, with proceeds going to elder advocacy groups. Then Emily's expression softened as she mentioned Lauren again, explaining that she had written another letter and that her lawyer said she wanted to apologize and ask for forgiveness. Lauren had sent me 17 letters from prison. I read the first few, which swung between excuses and desperation, and then stopped opening them. Some relationships, once broken, cannot be mended with words. I asked Emily whether my position had changed, and she said it had not, though people do evolve, even those who make terrible choices. I thought about the woman I had been 6 months earlier, grieving, dependent, ready to accept whatever scraps of dignity my family offered. That woman might have felt obligated to forgive Lauren out of guilt and tradition, but she no longer existed. I told Emily to arrange a meeting with Lauren's lawyer, not to reconcile, but to make one thing clear. She asked what I meant, and I said I wanted Lauren to understand that her actions carried consequences beyond prison, that she had destroyed our relationship permanently, and that her children would grow up knowing why their mother went to jail. Emily said that sounded harsh, and I replied that it was meant to be. Lauren made adult choices that harmed the people she claimed to love, and she did not get to escape the emotional cost simply by writing letters. Emily noted this in her leather folder and mentioned that Lauren had requested supervised visits with her children. I told her that my relationship with those grandchildren would depend on who they became as adults, not on their mother's attempts at rehabilitation. The doorbell rang, and through the window I saw a delivery truck carrying a large package. I told Emily it must be the new furniture for the studio. Turning Thomas's old den into an art studio had been my favorite renovation. It was now bright and airy, and I was rediscovering my love of painting, something I had abandoned when I married and stepped into the role of supporting wife and mother. Emily asked me something personal, whether I ever regretted how everything had unfolded, the prison sentences, the publicity, the permanent family rupture. I paused while signing for the delivery. 6 months earlier I had been invisible, a widow with no money, no home and no future. Now I was a philanthropist with a foundation, a documentary, and a purpose larger than my own survival. I told her that my daughter had tried to steal everything I owned and leave me homeless, that my son-in-law had forged documents and tried to blackmail me, and that they revealed exactly who they were when they believed I was powerless. Emily said they were still family, and I answered that they were only DNA because real family protects you when you are vulnerable instead of exploiting you for profit. She closed her folder satisfied. I added that when I stopped letting them define my worth, I discovered who I truly was. After Emily left, I walked through the rooms of my house, truly mine now, decorated to my taste and organized around my priorities. In the art studio I uncovered my latest painting, a self-portrait of a woman standing in sunlight, her face turned toward what comes next. She looked nothing like the grieving widow who had packed her life into 2 suitcases 6 months earlier. She looked strong, independent and unafraid, like someone who had learned that the finest revenge is not payback, but becoming everything your enemies never imagined you could be. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees I had planted myself, In soil that belonged to me on land I defended with intelligence and courage instead of inheriting through marriage or birth. The next day I would keep building the life I chose, not the one others tried to assign me. And if Lauren ever hoped to be part of that life again, she would need far more than prison letters and empty apologies. She would need a transformation as complete as my own. Thank you for listening. Please remember to subscribe, and feel free to share your own story in the comments, because your voice truly matters.